Let's begin here, because too many mistake discomfort for dysfunction. When the doorbell rings and something tightens in your chest, it doesn't mean you're rude. When your shoulders sink at the thought of small talk, you are not broken. There is nothing wrong with preferring silence over chatter or solitude over surprise visits. Still, you've been told it's impolite to feel that way, that you should be more open, more welcoming, more social. But deep down, you already know the truth. You don't hate people, you just feel different once they enter your space. Something shifts, something drains. And that subtle shift is where your soul begins to speak. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, here's what few will say out loud. Not wanting visitors doesn't make you antisocial. It often means you are protecting something sacred, your inner balance. Carl Jung taught that the home is not just a shelter. It is a mirror of the soul. To some, a guest is just another presence in the room. But to those on the path of inner work, a visitor means more. More energy to hold more noise, to process more of the self to manage. You might smile. You might make coffee. You might ask how they've been. But somewhere under the surface, your energy has already started to fade. Why? Because their presence activates your persona, the social mask. And the moment that mask goes on, your real self steps back. Jung described introversion not as a choice, but as a deep psychic orientation. For the introverted soul, peace is not found in more conversation, but in less. And the home is not just a place to rest. It is where the soul reorganizes. It is where the unconscious breathes. When someone crosses that threshold, even with kindness, your psyche doesn't just greet them. It braces itself. And that is where we begin this journey. Not in the noise of social gatherings, but in the quiet discomfort no one talks about. The feeling that you should open the door, but don't want to. The guilt that follows, and the wisdom hiding beneath it. This is not about avoiding others. It is about returning to yourself. And in the hours ahead, we will walk that path together. Step by step, inward, toward the truth of why solitude is not failure, but a necessary step toward becoming whole. There is a moment quiet and nearly invisible when a person begins to drift away from their center. It doesn't announce itself with thunder. It arrives in a smile that feels slightly forced, in a yes said out of guilt, in a door open not with joy, but with hesitation. She may tell herself it's nothing, just a visit, just being polite. But deep down, something inside starts to shift. At first, it's small, a quiet discomfort she brushes aside. But over time, these small concessions accumulate. And with every one, she feels a little more scattered, a little more brittle, a little less herself. Carl Jung once said that the soul suffers when we mistake the persona for the self. And this is where the fracture begins. Not in violence, but in small betrayals of our own boundaries. You feel it most clearly in the hours after a visit, when the house is quiet again, when the voices are gone but your mind is still crowded, when you realize how much energy you gave and how little you had to begin with. That is the first sign. You are operating beyond your energetic limit, not because you are weak, but because your nervous system was never meant to carry so many unspoken expectations. And yet, this is where many begin to doubt themselves. They look around and see others hosting without hesitation. They watch neighbors gather friends, laugh, families open their homes, and they think maybe something's wrong with me. But Jung teaches us when the soul is in conflict with the image we present to the world, the body becomes the battleground. What you suppress in the psyche appears in behavior, in energy, in fatigue. So she keeps saying yes, keeps putting on the face, keeps being agreeable. But inside, resentment starts to grow, not toward the visitor, but toward herself. Because deep down, she knows she's gone against something sacred. She has opened her door, not from joy, but from pressure. She has welcomed someone into a space her spirit had not prepared. And that is where the crack begins. Not between her and others, but between her and her truth. You might notice it in the tightness in your chest when someone lingers too long, or in the sudden wave of relief after they leave. You smile as they walk away, but the moment the door clicks shut, you exhale like someone coming up for air. This is not selfishness. This is not coldness. This is the soul crying out for its rightful space. But because we live in a world that equates kindness with availability, many override this inner signal again and again. They tell themselves it's better to be agreeable than authentic, better to keep the peace than to risk judgment. But peace bought at the price of self-abandonment is not peace, it's silence under pressure. Jung warned us the more we ignore the unconscious, the louder it becomes. And for many, that loudness begins with a deep inner fatigue, a weariness not just of the body, but of the soul. A heaviness that says, I am carrying too much that does not belong to me. This is the first fracture, the slow erosion of the inner boundary, when you no longer trust yourself to say no. When you say yes, even as your body says no. When you stop checking in with your own energy and start performing for the sake of appearances. Some learn this pattern early. They are taught that being good means being welcoming, that to refuse a guest is rude, that solitude is suspicious. They are told implicitly or explicitly that their value is in how much they give, not how deeply they honor their own needs. But Jung's work reminds us that every betrayal of the self leaves a trace. It shows up in burnout, in irritability we can't explain, in the quiet dread that surfaces when someone says, I might stop by. She might tidy the house. She might smile at the door. But inside, she feels herself dimming. Not because she lacks love, but because she has no energy left to give it honestly. And here, the emotional fracture deepens, because she starts to resent not just the guest, but the version of herself that keeps pretending. She senses something's off, but doesn't yet have the language for it. All she knows is that her space no longer feels like home when it's been offered from guilt. This is the crisis point of many gentle souls. They want to be kind. They want to be warm. They want to be open-hearted. But the very act of being kind, if done from obligation, turns against them. And the world doesn't see the cost. Jung believed that the psyche always seeks balance. If you give too much to the outer world, the inner world will rebel. And that rebellion may look like withdrawal, like sadness, like an unexplainable ache in your chest when the living room is no longer yours. The first fracture isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It begins the day you start saying yes with your lips while whispering no in your heart. And what follows, if left unacknowledged, is disconnection from yourself, from your space, from the deeper truth that your discomfort is not a problem to fix, but a message to understand. So, let this part of the journey be an honest one. Let it speak to the subtle guilt you've carried, the times you were gracious but depleted, the times you smiled while bracing yourself inside, and the slow realization that something has to change. Because healing begins the moment you stop betraying yourself to meet the world's expectations. And that is where we go next, to the place where the mask begins to slip, where the soul asks, if this isn't me, who am I really? And the shadow long ignored begins to stir. So much of what we call politeness is performance. We put on a smile even when we're tired. We hold conversations even when our minds have already drifted towards silence. And we open our doors even when something deep within us quietly begs for solitude. This is not deception. It's survival. It's the persona, the mask we wear to make the world more manageable. Jung taught that the persona is not evil or false. It's a necessary part of being human. A way to adapt to family work society, to show up in a way others can understand. But here is the danger. When the mask is worn too long, we begin to confuse it with who we really are. We start to believe we are only what others approve of. And in doing so, we abandon vast parts of ourselves, the parts that live in shadow. The shadow, Jung said, is everything within us that we have rejected or pushed away. Not just the ugly or the angry, but the forgotten, the sensitive child, the woman who needs rest, the part of you that longs to say, I'm not available today, but never learned how. And when someone visits, even someone kind, even someone loved, they don't just enter your house. They step into your field, and that's when the shadow stirs. Because the moment another person is present, your persona activates. It straightens your posture. It selects your words. It watches the clock. You begin to shape your environment for them, not for yourself. And all the energy you had set aside for healing is suddenly spent performing. At first, you may not notice. You think you're just being a good host, but your nervous system knows the difference. It knows when you are in alignment and when you are split in two. This is why for many, a simple visit becomes exhausting. Not because of the conversation, but because of the contradiction. One part of you is smiling. Another part is retreating, folding inward, quietly disappearing. And the longer this continues, the more fragmented you feel. Your body is present. Your mind is drifting. Your heart is flat or numb or irritable, and you can't explain why. This is the price of living from the persona while leaving the shadow unattended. You are doing what looks right, but you are not doing what feels true. She starts to notice it after the guests leave. The stillness returns, but something feels missing. She sits in her own home, and yet doesn't feel quite at home in herself. Because every time she overextends, she loses a little bit of her own center. Jung warned that anything we reject inwardly gains power in the dark. If the shadow is not integrated, it does not disappear. It shows up through mood, tension, resentment, and withdrawal. It speaks through sighs, through fatigue, through the ache to be alone. And the saddest part, no one else sees it. To others, she seems kind, warm, engaging, but inside, she is shrinking slowly, quietly, invisibly. This is why Jung's work speaks so deeply to the unseen life. Because we live in a world that rewards the mask, the smiles, the good manners, the giving. But the soul does not care for appearances. It wants integration. And that begins when you stop ignoring your discomfort, when you stop apologizing for your need to retreat, when you listen to the part of you that recoils, not to judge it, but to understand it. Because beneath every act of false agreement is a longing to be whole again, to live without splitting, to breathe without bracing, to open the door only when your spirit has also said yes. But the shadow doesn't just hold discomfort, it holds intelligence. It carries all the parts of you that know your truth, even when your persona forgets it. The shadow knows when you are pretending. It knows when your smile is strained. It knows when the conversation is costing you more than you're willing to admit. And if you listen closely, it also knows what you need. This is not about rejecting others. It is about reuniting with the self, because when you are always performing, you lose touch with the part of you that feels, that rests, that remembers who you were before the roles, before the habits, before the pressure to always be pleasant, even when your soul needs silence. And here lies the deeper work, to meet the shadow, not as enemy, but as messenger, to ask, what am I pretending not to feel? Who am I becoming when I say yes out of guilt? And more gently still, what would it look like to live without this mask? Even just at home, Jung believed that the house represents the psyche. Each room holds a part of who we are. The basement, the unconscious. The attic, our higher mind. And the living room, our public face, our persona. But when visitors enter uninvited, they flood every room. And suddenly, even the bedroom, the place of deepest intimacy, doesn't feel safe. This is why some women dread the knock on the door, not because they don't love people, but because they've lost the ability to rest in their own space without interruption. And over time, if this isn't named, it becomes internalized as shame. I'm too sensitive. I'm just difficult. I should be more welcoming. But none of this is true. You are not broken for needing boundaries. You are not selfish for needing silence. You are not cold for choosing rest over performance. You are simply hearing the call to return to yourself. And that return often begins with seeing the shadow clearly, with recognizing that the part of you that recoils is also the part that remembers who you really are. When you feel that discomfort rise, that sudden resistance to a visitor, a call, a plan, don't override it immediately. Pause. Listen. Ask what part of you is being activated and what part is being ignored. Because that is where the healing begins. Not in rejecting the world, but in choosing not to abandon yourself in order to please it. And if the persona must be worn, let it be by choice, not compulsion. Let it serve your truth, not conceal it. Let it be something you wear for a time, but always know how to take off. That is the work of integration. And in the next chapter, we will explore what happens when that realization begins to awaken. When the soul begins to whisper, there is another way to live. One where your door opens only when your heart is also ready, and your silence is no longer a secret shame, but a sacred choice. There comes a point when the fatigue of pretending can no longer be explained away. The body grows heavy, the heart feels muted, and the smile that once concealed the truth begins to falter. This is not collapse. It is the beginning of awakening. For years, she may have thought the discomfort with visitors meant something was wrong, that she lacked warmth or generosity or social grace. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, she realizes the truth. The resistance is not against people. It is against living out of alignment with her own essence. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the long journey of becoming who you truly are. This process does not begin in noise, but in silence, not in the approval of others, but in the moment you notice your own inner contradiction and decide to face it. What once felt like weakness begins to reveal itself as guidance. She notices it in the smallest gestures, the sigh of relief after the door closes, the deep calm when she turns the key and enters an empty house, the peace that fills her body when there is no mask to wear. What once felt like isolation begins to shine as sacred solitude. Awakening often arrives quietly. It is the gentle but steady awareness that saying yes when you mean no is a fracture of the soul. It is the dawning realization that every time you betray your inner boundary, you lose touch with your wholeness, and that this cost is far greater than any judgment from others. Here, the shadow steps out of the dark and into view. She sees how her unease with visitors is not a flaw, but a signal. The shadow has been calling her to protect the fragile place where her truth resides. And instead of resisting that call, she begins to honor it. The home itself becomes a mirror of this awakening. Jung often used the image of the house to describe the psyche. Each room is an aspect of the self, and the front door is not just wood and hinges, but a threshold of energy. She realizes that to leave her door unguarded is to invite disorder into her soul. The turning point is this recognition. Her discomfort is not shameful. It is sacred. It is the voice of her unconscious asking to be heard. The awkward tension she once tried to silence is now understood as a compass pointing her inward. This is where light begins to meet shadow. She recognizes the persona the mask she wears to please for what it is. Useful, but not absolute. Necessary, but not ultimate. The mask can serve her, but it cannot define her. Awakening does not demand that she discard the persona entirely. It asks only that she no longer mistake it for her identity. The moment she sees the difference, she can choose when to wear it and when to lay it aside. And in that choice, freedom begins. This shift is subtle but profound. Instead of dreading visitors as threats, she sees them as mirrors. They reflect the places where she still feels divided. They remind her where the mask is still too heavy. And through that reflection, she gains clarity. Awakening is also the discovery of archetypes that live within us. In this stage, the hermit steps forward, the inner figure who seeks solitude not as escape, but as wisdom. The hermit holds the lantern in the dark night, reminding us that silence reveals what noise conceals. This archetype whispers that retreat is not weakness, but preparation. That solitude is not emptiness, but fullness waiting to be heard. And so, she begins to trust the call inward. She notices that when she honors her need for quiet, her energy returns. Her thoughts sharpen, her emotions steady. She feels more alive, not less. This is the paradox of awakening. By closing the door, she opens a deeper one. By turning away from outer pressure, she turns toward inner truth. And in that shift, she begins to live not out of obligation, but out of authenticity. Awakening does not erase fear. It does not end the guilt instantly, but it introduces a new presence within her, a voice that says you are allowed to honor yourself. You are permitted to choose silence. You do not have to explain. From this point forward, every choice begins to feel different. The familiar patterns of fatigue and resentment lose some of their power. She no longer interprets them as signs of failure, but as signals of misalignment. And with every small correction, she feels the return of her strength. This is the threshold moment of the journey. The mask is seen for what it is. The shadow is understood as guide, not enemy. And solitude, once feared, is embraced as medicine. Awakening is not dramatic. It rarely comes with fireworks or applause. It comes in the quiet decision to no longer betray the self for the comfort of others. It comes in the relief of saying no without apology. It comes in the sacred pause before opening the door where she asks, "Is my soul ready for this?" And when the answer is no, she listens. Not out of rebellion, but out of respect. Because the truth of awakening is this: you cannot become whole by abandoning yourself. You only become whole by returning to the place where your true self has always waited. And this is where the journey begins to shift toward transformation. What was once guilt begins to transform into boundary. What was once exhaustion begins to transform into clarity. And what was once shame begins to transform into dignity. From here, the path of individuation opens wider. The choice is no longer between pleasing others and being true to herself. The choice is between continuing in fracture or finally living whole. And in that choice, she discovers the strength she did not know she had. This is the essence of awakening: to see the mask to meet the shadow, and to realize that neither defines you. You are more than both. You are the one who chooses. And from that choice comes the possibility of transformation, the possibility of living without apology, the possibility of a home, inner and outer, that feels like sanctuary again. In the next chapter, we will step into that possibility. We will explore the moment when awakening becomes action, when she sets the boundary not just in thought, but in deed. And in doing so, she reclaims her life as her own. Awakening is only the beginning. Clarity by itself is not enough. For the soul to grow, realization must become action. And action in this stage of the journey means boundary. There comes a moment when she recognizes that she cannot keep living divided, that she cannot keep opening her door out of guilt or entertaining guests from a place of depletion. And so she begins to act differently, not with aggression, but with quiet resolve. Carl Jung taught that individuation requires confrontation, not necessarily with others, but with the parts of ourselves that resist change. The inner voice that says you will disappoint them if you refuse, or they won't understand if you choose yourself. This voice is the remnant of the persona, the mask that fears rejection. But transformation requires her to listen to a deeper voice, the one that whispers, protect your center. The first boundary is often small. It may look like declining a visit politely. It may look like silencing the phone for a night. It may look like sitting in the quiet without explaining herself to anyone. And though small, these acts carry immense weight, because the moment she says no without apology, she steps into her own authority. No longer is she ruled by the expectations of others. She has chosen to honor her truth. And in that choice, her soul expands. Boundaries are often misunderstood. They are not walls of hostility. They are thresholds of integrity. The front door of the house becomes a symbol of this. It is not meant to stay forever open, nor to be sealed shut. It is meant to open when she is ready and close when she is not. Jung might say that in setting a boundary, she is no longer confusing the persona with the self. She is letting the persona serve her rather than dominate her. She is using it consciously instead of unconsciously. And that simple shift changes everything. The shadow, too, responds to this transformation. When ignored, the shadow erupts in irritation, exhaustion, even hidden resentment. But when respected, it becomes an ally. By closing the door, when her energy is fragile, she honors the shadow's warning. She acknowledges the depth of her own needs, and in doing so, the shadow begins to integrate. Transformation is not always welcomed by others. There will be those who notice the change and feel unsettled. They may ask why she has grown distant, or why she no longer says yes so easily. But this discomfort belongs to them, not to her. Because the truth is, each boundary she sets clarifies who values her authenticity and who only valued her compliance. This is where courage is required. The courage to withstand disapproval. The courage to let go of roles that once earned praise. The courage to accept that not every relationship survives the honesty of individuation. And yet, paradoxically, it is only by setting these boundaries that true intimacy becomes possible. Because now, when she says yes, it is genuine. Her presence is no longer diluted by resentment or fatigue. It is rooted in wholeness, in choice and freedom. The mask drops, and what remains is real connection. Transformation is rarely a single dramatic act. It is the steady accumulation of consistent choices. Day by day, she chooses to honor her inner signals. Day by day, she practices saying no without guilt and yes without fear. And slowly, her life begins to feel like her own again. The home once invaded by uninvited energies becomes sacred space. Each room feels clear, peaceful, alive. Because she no longer allows her boundaries to be crossed unconsciously, she feels at home not only in her house, but in herself. Jung often said that what we resist persists. For years, she resisted her own discomfort, and it persisted as exhaustion. But now, by facing it directly, she finds relief. The anxiety fades because the truth has been honored. The fatigue lifts because the soul is no longer at war with itself. This is the quiet miracle of transformation. It is not about becoming someone new, but about returning to who you always were beneath the mask. The self that does not apologize for needing rest. The self that knows solitude is sacred. The self that can meet the world openly, but only after first meeting herself. And with each boundary set, she discovers a new kind of strength. Not the brittle strength of endurance, but the supple strength of alignment. Not the strength to carry more than she should, but the strength to carry only what belongs to her. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of integration. The persona is no longer mistaken for the whole self. The shadow is no longer feared, but respected. In the center of the psyche, the self with a capital S begins to guide her life. Transformation is not without challenge. The old patterns will return, testing her resolve. There will be times she slips back into overgiving, into smiling when she doesn't want to. But now she notices. Now she recognizes the feeling of fracture and corrects more quickly. Awareness has made her free. This is the turning point of the journey. She is no longer a passive participant in her own depletion. She is an active guardian of her inner life. And this guardianship is not selfishness. It is the very foundation of love. For only a soul that respects its own limits can offer authentic care to others. In this stage, she begins to feel something she has not felt in years: dignity. Not pride based on how much she gives away, but dignity rooted in her wholeness. The dignity of a woman who knows when to open the door and when to keep it closed. The dignity of someone who no longer betrays herself for appearances. And this dignity radiates quietly. Others sense it, even if they cannot name it. They may approach her differently with more respect. They may learn by watching her that boundaries are not barriers, but teachings. That wholeness is not a gift from others, but a commitment to oneself. The act of transformation is not about rejecting visitors forever. It is about creating a life in which every yes is authentic and every no is honored. It is about turning a house back into a sanctuary and a self back into a center. And this is the gift of individuation. To no longer be trapped in the false binary of pleasing others or isolating completely, but to live in balance, where solitude and connection coexist in harmony, where silence is chosen, not feared, and where the soul is free to breathe. From here, the path turns toward integration. The boundary has been set. The transformation has begun. And now, in the final stage, comes the task of living this truth day by day. Not as rebellion, but as wisdom. Not as withdrawal, but as presence. A life lived not in fragments, but in wholeness. Every journey must find its close, and this one ends not with noise, but with stillness. What began as discomfort at the doorbell has revealed itself as something far deeper, a dialogue between the mask, the shadow, and the soul. Through this unfolding, we see that the resistance to visitors was never a flaw. It was an invitation to listen to the inner life, to protect what is sacred, and to live from authenticity rather than appearance. Carl Jung often said that individuation is the process of becoming who we truly are. not the roles we were given, not the masks we learned to wear, but the full self-light and shadow conscious and unconscious woven into wholeness. And in learning to say no without guilt, we glimpse the first steps of that journey. For many, solitude is mistaken for emptiness. But here, we understand solitude as a temple. The home becomes not just a shelter of walls, but a reflection of the psyche itself. Each room is part of the self, each threshold a boundary of dignity. When honored, the home mirrors balance within. When disregarded, it reflects fracture. The lesson then is simple. Your space, both inner and outer, is not selfish to protect. It is necessary. Because only in silence does the unconscious rise to meet you. Only in solitude do you find the strength to integrate what has been scattered. And only from wholeness can true connection flow outward. The shadow once feared is no longer enemy, but teacher. It warns when you are straying, and it calls you back when you forget. The persona once mistaken for your identity is seen now as a tool useful, but never the whole truth. And the self, the deep center of your being, steps forward as the quiet guide. This is not the end of the struggle. There will still be moments when the old habits return. Times when you feel guilty for closing the door or tempted to perform once more. But now you recognize the feeling. Now you can hear the difference between obligation and truth. And with every conscious choice, you strengthen the bond with your inner life. Think of it as a rhythm. There are times to open and times to close, times to share and times to withdraw. Just as day turns to night and the tide rises and falls, the soul, too, must honor its own cycles. When you live in harmony with this rhythm, life no longer feels like fracture. It feels like flow. And perhaps this is the most important insight. Boundaries are not walls against love. They are gates that protect love's authenticity. By saying no, when your spirit is not ready, you create the possibility of saying yes with your whole self later. And that yes carries more truth, more presence, more warmth than 100 false agreements ever could. So where does this leave us? With a truth that is at once simple and profound. You are not strange for desiring solitude. You are not unkind for needing space. You are not flawed for guarding your home and your heart. You are walking the path of individuation, where self-respect becomes the foundation of all true connection. Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate what is important to us." When you honor your solitude, you prepare to speak with clarity. When you honor your silence, you prepare to connect more deeply. And when you honor your boundaries, you allow your soul to meet others not in fragments, but in fullness. So let the doorbell ring if it must. You now know that you have a choice. You may open, or you may not. Both are valid. Both are expressions of your dignity. And the strength lies not in always welcoming or always refusing, but in discerning the moment when your soul is ready. That is the wisdom of individuation. That is the light of the hermit's lantern shining in the night. Not to isolate forever, but to guide you inward, so that when you step outward again, You do so as your whole self. As we close this reflection, let the final image be simple. A quiet home at dusk. The lights soft, the room still. A woman sits in her chair by the window, at ease in her own company. No performance, no guilt, only presence. In that presence, she is not diminished. She is renewed. And from that renewal, she can meet the world again with authenticity. This is the gift of solitude and the lesson of boundaries. When you honor yourself, you do not lose others. You gain the ground on which all true relationships stand. Before we end, I invite you to take a moment for yourself. Notice how your body feels as you listen. Notice if your soul is asking for quiet or for connection. Honor that signal without judgment. And if these reflections touched something within you, I would love to hear where you are listening from. Share your thoughts in the comments, not as noise, but as part of this circle of quiet voices across the world. Above all, remember this: your way of being is not a flaw. It is your soul's language. And when you learn to honor it, you step closer each day to the wholeness you were always meant to live.